You're our second V today. Welcome.
Who would have thought?
Thank you so much for joining us. Really, really, really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
I know TikTok is kind of, you're old, you're no longer there, but if you can entertain us to talk a little bit about it, but would also just love to know what's alive for you. But let's start with TikTok. It was the most downloaded app in the United States in 2020, 2021, I think 2022, like crazy. Mm-hmm. You were around watching that.
More than just watching.
Creating that. What was your sense of what that hit in society that made it so compelling?
Totally. I think, it's worthwhile starting with context. And, certainly we saw the rise of TikTok even before that, certainly with Gen Z and really resonating with younger people, but certainly with the impact that COVID had around the world and everybody in shutdown, we saw that huge shift to online consumption and looking for a way to connect with people. I think we are still coming out of that phase of isolation and fatigue that we were experiencing. And TikTok at that moment really provided that value of not feeling as isolated and finding a sense of belonging for individuals. And that was incredibly powerful, and that happened around the world. The other thing I would say is that TikTok really was a different way of presenting media and to create. And so when you think of all the social platforms that happened before, I believe there was a lot of fatigue with the Twitters and Facebooks, Instagrams of the world, which were all predicated on a social graph. It was who you followed, which celebrity, what friend, that was curating your experience. And then along came TikTok and really turned that on its head and said, no, actually, let's make the content the first thing. Mm-hmm. Let's make this about your interests and present that first. And I think that was hugely democratizing for the content and the way that content was discovered and consumed.
And was that so the algorithm is the default.
Yes.
I can choose to move over to look at the followers, yeah. But the algorithm is the default, which means trust us. We can figure out, rather than you having to go to all these places and follow all these people, we can figure that out for you. And it seems to have really worked. And could you tell us, was that decision already made, or was there a big debate about how do we do this and does that work or not?
No, that decision was already made. And again, I think it was around this premise of how do you make consumption super easy, and how do you democratize the ability for people to be seen? Coming from the world of YouTube prior to that, I was hearing a lot about creators not knowing how to reach their audiences, and it became a place of the few having success and not the many. And so when TikTok came around with this change in focus, what we saw was the ability to reach a global audience at speed by posting content that resonated with others. And that really did have a huge shift in how people consume media.
And so just to be clear, if I'm a 15 or 16-year-old and I'm on one of the older platforms and I have 10 followers and I post something, most likely those 10 followers see it and no one else. Yes. And TikTok is we're not going to base it on your follower account. We're going to base it on traction. And so for a young person or somebody who doesn't have a lot of followers, that's really exciting because the potential is wow.
Yes.
And it happens sometimes,
yes.
Right? That moves.
Yeah.
I want to talk about all the different aspects because I know anything, there's beautiful things about it and challenging things about it. Can we talk a little bit about what you see some of the positives are of what this means that this level of interest is so strong? Mm-hmm. How is it benefiting people's lives in a positive way that you see?
It's a big question.
Well, I know, for example, one way is I know single moms who used to have to drive to work and go back and forth, and now they stay home and they have a TikTok or Instagram side business, side hustle, and they create this thing and they market it there, and they don't have to. They can be with their kid and have a business while being with their kid, and they don't have to go to the other place to take care of somebody else's business. Yeah. So I think for certain entrepreneurs, these new social platforms create a new marketplace for them. And so to me, that's one, but there's probably various others. So yeah.
Yeah, there's many ways that I can see the positivity of TikTok, and certainly the small businesses that have arisen on the platform, the ability for people to connect, no matter where you are in the world, but to find an audience. And that can have a social impact, that can have a human impact. So again, during COVID, that feeling of isolation and knowing that you could find your tribe on TikTok and you could find your own voice. When you think of it from a political perspective, we are seeing marginalized voices having a place and having a community, and that is incredibly powerful and empowering in today's world. When we're seeing what's happening with Russia and Ukraine, Israel and the Palestinian conflict, with all the anti-abortion laws that happened in the US, we're providing these voices to have a home. And the power of community, for me, is one of the things that was the most powerful and is the most powerful part of TikTok. And what really inspired me every day was the ability to connect humans and connect stories and the power of what can come from that. So whether that is enabling small businesses and single moms to find a way to a means to an end that is different to what they would be able to have before, for marginalized voices to have a sense of community, and the impact of being able to be differently informed than relying on our current structures that are in place today.
Right. And so they don't have to wait for whether it gets covered by CNN or Fox, or they can have their own direct experience. And so I think, one of the challenges in some ways that I feel like with social media is in some ways it's become too successful. It almost got too good at keeping attention and giving people kind of what they wanted. It's such that like the hours and hours that I think people are now spending, particularly young people, the society is now questioning, is this a good thing? It's a good thing in doses, but is it a good thing when that becomes kind of your main hangout spot, which kind of needed to happen in COVID, but now that it doesn't need to happen? And I'm curious how you think about that, because I know you have kids and there's this like need for human connection. But the algorithms are so freaking good, and it can just keep us, whether it's YouTube algorithm or Instagram algorithm or TikTok algorithm, it can kind of keep us in this loop where it's less effective in terms of my needs, and it's more just kind of like feeding me things that are not that, I mean, they're not bad, but they're also, if you look at a healthy life, it's not necessarily leading to that. And so as you think about that for yourself and for about kids, how do you guide us in some balance with it, particularly as AI maybe even makes the algorithms even more sophisticated and enticing? How do we navigate what a society looks like when that skill is like really, really amplified?
It's another big question, and I think there's such a complexity to that question too, and it's certainly also not a new question when we think about media, right? Ever since the printed word, that was demonized when it first came out, to then television and looking at how much time people still consume TV today. It's still around 5 hours in the US.
Wow.
And to now social media and how much time people are spending online. And there's certainly pitfalls and risks to that. Screens, do have the potential to have addiction and wasted time spent, right? And I think those are concerns that we need to look at in a really honest way of what can we be doing to address those pitfalls, particularly around safeguarding our younger users who may not have the wherewithal to understand some of those pitfalls and real risks. I do think that the majority of users and people who consume online have a digital savviness about them. They know how to interpret what they're looking at and how to self-regulate. But for me, it's about the younger users. I have kids, but they're way too young to be online. They're 6 and 8, so we have very kind of strict rules in my family about just watching, movies and TV that we know and can verify. But I do think that we need to raise the bar for young people online, knowing the risks associated with it. And I think we have to do that through a few ways. One, there's a responsibility to the platforms themselves. So whether it's TikTok, Meta, Twitter, X, and all these platforms, what are the controls that they're giving users to really safeguard younger users on the platform? And so that's screen time controls, that's parental oversight. What are the tools that they're enabling? I also think that we need to be doing more on age verification, and I think that has to happen not just at the platform level, but also at the device level, through the the guardians of that, which are largely Apple and Google when you think of the devices. And then from a regulatory perspective, the regulation right now is really having a tough time keeping up with the advances of technology. And so I think conversations really need to come about that. And then beyond that, once we have the user controls in place, the regulatory enablement, then better education needs to happen within schools and for parents as well.
And would you, I know you might not want to answer, but what do you think is the right age? As you look at your children and you're like, the power of that system, and you also know, like Jonathan Haidt, who wrote The Anxious Generation, he brings up this point that for boys, they're a little more inclined to video games. It's like competitiveness there, they want to win. For girls, they're just super attuned to social relationships, and so who's commented, who's not commented, what friend is now this, and like Snap lets you see like where friends are gathering, and like who's your closest snaps, and like there's all this like comparison there. And that for girls, young girls who haven't kind of like developed, they're still developing, they're still finding their place, that they struggle in particular ways because they're trying to find their place, and if they get less points than somebody else. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that. And I know Europe has tried to make it like I think they have to have a paid version with no ads, which might have some benefit here. But I'm wondering how to balance that need for a kid to feel like they belong, but then within the social, it's also points and numbers and likes. And so there's like this sense of the younger girl, not always feeling like, am I less than or better than? And I'm curious how we can maybe think through that, or if you've thought about that.
Definitely. I do think the EU is far more advanced than the US in thinking through a lot of these things. Like age of consent is 16 instead of in the US it's 13. And so when we think about age, for me, I do think that the EU is taking a better approach. And I think the US has some work to do to catch up to that. At the end of the day, it is a bit of a personal decision based on parent and guardian and caretaker as to what feels right for their family. But I think there is a greater susceptibility to young girls than there are to young boys, and we need to have more research that goes into that to define those age brackets. But my personal sense is it needs to be higher than 13.
Yeah, my personal sense is too. And I can't remember what age, my son's now 21, and I can't remember what age, but I remember he snuck on early, and he posted something, and my friend was like head of security at Meta at the time. And he texted me, and he's like, Navar should not be on. He did not. He's like, now that I've seen it, I have to delete him. So I was telling my son, I was like, sorry, you can't have that account. But I do think that age verification thing is so important, because the kids will just do what the kids do.
It's critical.
And then how do we educate the kids on the importance of human contact? The importance of exercise, the importance of, and it's easy as like, I get older, I'm 56 now, and I look back and like, oh, well, I had it, when we were young, we went and played outside, and we did all these things. And so what are the key elements we need to make sure our kids know? And what is just our own ageism that we think we know better because we did something?
I think even the dichotomy of what you're saying, which is like online, offline, good, bad, there's a lot of presumptions that go into that. And so when we think about...
I don't know, but I think the data would suggest that if you sit all day long and if you don't have friends, that's actually unhealthy for most people.
Yes.
So I don't know if it's a presumption, but I do think there's some data behind that.
Yes, and I think there's multiple truths here.
Okay.
Which is, yes, it's healthy to have real human connection. What we're doing right now is important. And I think everything that we saw coming out of COVID is proof point to that. But that's not to say that online connection is not valid and needed. So when I look at the impact that online communities can have, whether to the individual or to marginalized groups, those are as meaningful and as powerful as real-world connections as well, and they enable them. So as somebody who identifies as queer, as somebody who did not grow up in the digital age, and was not able to see similar ways of self-expression, where we are today is night and day from where I grew up. And when I think about that kid that's sitting in his bedroom or their bedroom in Kansas, not having the ability to know their community, there is real power in that in terms of what these online platforms can enable. Again, I think there's multiple truths in terms of what is human connection and our definition of good.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, and the data that I've seen, and this was a while ago, was that they were looking at loneliness, and I can't remember. I think it was Facebook at the time, and they said if you're using it without human connection, generally it increases loneliness. If you're using it and it's in your, you're trying to have some human connection as part of that, that's actually an avenue for human connection. Then it's like a fuel source for beneficial things. Like, oh, there's this group that's meeting. And I think that there's a lot more studies that need to happen so we understand. And then if we do understand that after a certain amount, it actually gets like, I don't know, 2 hours at a time, is the government come in and say, which I think China has come in and done their own versions of that, which is like, we know that more than this is unhealthy, so we're just going to come in. Because I think asking the platforms to kind of oversee themselves, I think is not the right question, because they're like, well, everyone else is doing, like, let's tell our investors that we're going to stop, TikTok only 2 hours a day, whatever. And so I do think some of this is up to the culture and the society to say, okay, if we all believe that this age should be this age, let's make legislation for that. If we all believe that, 2 hours is enough, then we're going to stop it at 2 hours so that the platforms don't have to make those decisions.
Yeah, again, I agree that it's not only on the platforms. I think the platforms, again, really need to provide the users with the controls and settings to enable those types of self-restrictions, and for the parents and guardians and caretakers to be able to implement them. More research, more like discussions at the regulatory level are definitely needed, and that's where I see we are falling behind when we look at where we are on the global side.
Yeah. And do you have a sense, like, as you kind of look back, because you've had such a unique world. Like most of us, like we see things from the outside, like you got to build and experience on the inside. What is it? Is there anything you want to tell us about what we should know as we kind of navigate our own right relationship with the different? And this year it's TikTok. Who knows what next year it could be some new thing. Like, there's always going to be new things emergent, right? And like how we better assess our own dance with this hugely powerful, meaningful, potentially not useful, potentially useful force. Do you have a sense of what questions or things we should be looking at?
I think when you're looking at social media and online consumption, there are so many positives, but also those areas where it's challenging for us, and particularly in today's age where we're faced, we're in an election year. There's misinformation, disinformation. We are now getting challenged with AI generation, deep fakes. So I think a lot of how do we have a critical view to what we are seeing online. And that is something that we need to teach younger children as well, as we're coming up in this age where the credible kind of old guard institutions are no longer there, which is also a positive, right? Again, citizen journalism, abilities for self-expression, for communities to come up and have a voice. I think those are all some of the positives. But how we navigate in this digital world without the credible kind of authoritative news outlets and so on can be a very daunting task, and I think that gets even more challenged and more stretched as AI and generation deepfakes come into the picture in a bigger way. So from a platform perspective, I think we do need to ensure that there are safeguards there from misinformation labels, policies around all the misinformation, disinformation, having a real strong policy to take down that content when it is seen, and also, outside of labeling it, really being able to then inform the user as to what does it mean when they're viewing something that is artificially generated. And that's like the new frontier right there.
Yeah, it is. And do we have the technical capacity to actually identify that? Or will the technology be, the deep fakes be so deep and so fake that what is reality? I saw yesterday, Reid Hoffman created an AI, a founder of LinkedIn, created an AI that had read all of his books, everything he ever published, and it was Reed in one seat and his AI in a different seat on video, and his AI was having a conversation with him. And I could somewhat tell, but I was like amazed at this, like the mannerisms, the tone of voice, like all of this was similar. And hopefully the technology can keep up so that we actually know what is, actually maybe there isn't a reality.
I know, there's another
reality,
conversation, exactly.
But I do think that there's a question that as a society we're going to have to begin to ask, which is just like, what is reality?
Yes.
And what is healthy pieces of reality?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's a wild time. I didn't think I would grow up in this time. I thought like this
And
was
here
like
we are.
for somebody else to deal with. And now you literally have these worlds where telling what's fake and what's real is not easy.
And that's where I think personal experience and having a multiplicity of voices and expression and the power of local communities becomes really validated in this world. And it's an exciting and also sometimes scary premise to think, okay, if we're turning truth on its head or reality on its head, how do we navigate in this world? And so I think in some ways it comes back down to personal experience and what we can do as individuals and how we can express ourselves and what does that look like going forward.
And if my child wants to fall in love with the virtual AI robot,
hey.
Is that, yeah, do we celebrate that? Maybe, I don't know. Or do we say, go outside and like find a friend? I think a lot of those questions are going to be really interesting for us.
Yes.
And I do wonder, like, we've never had anybody come on and talk about TikTok, actually, and so I'm super glad that you're here to talk to us. And I was just curious, what made you say yes to being here today, if you know?
Great question. For me, I think these are really fascinating times, as we said, where we're seeing such a shift in how people are consuming, how people are creating, all the discussions that are coming up around AI and deepfakes. And it's just such a critical time to be having these conversations and to be thinking about the implications, both positive and negative. And I think TikTok is obviously such a big critical piece of understanding this today. It's had such an impact with over 1 billion users around the world and the kind of rapid scale of that. I think it's critical to continue to have conversation as to why that's happened over the last few years. What is that trend about? And then how do we understand that going forward?
Yeah. And I know we should just mention that there's a whole now process of whether it will be sold or banned, and that will probably go through the courts. But I don't know if you have any thoughts you want to mention on that, but just to name that that's also in the works, that there might be some shifts, depending on what the courts say. But any
I think for me,
that?
and certainly one to just address that, since I'm sure it's top of mind for many when you're seeing TikTok in the news. I think the first thing from my perspective is that the idea of a divestiture does not actually address any concerns around national security. For me, it's a bit of a worrying take. I think that the government should be looking at how do we address these concerns across all open and social platforms. There are real risks from a national security perspective when you think about foreign interference. There are real risks when we think about data privacy. None of these things are new, and none of these things are specific to TikTok. It's almost like we haven't learned from history with what we saw with Facebook, with what we saw with Cambridge Analytica in the 2016 elections. And that, to me, is worrying. The US is one of the few countries in the world that doesn't have a national privacy law. That's crazy.
That is
and so to take a one-off approach to the solution is, to me, I think, the wrong way to go about it. I think there are risks, and it is not TikTok specific, and we're kind of not addressing the root problem.
Yeah, okay, got it. So I've had this vision for a while that the platforms actually should sponsor wellness initiatives within the platform. So imagine you're on TikTok and you're seeing these different things, and all of a sudden there's this like image that comes up that says, "You are beautiful just as you are." And it's sponsored by the platform, reinforcing a certain quality. I can't get anybody to take my idea. I've tried. I'm like, let's create a wellness support thing here. Give me one post for every 25 organic posts, and let's give them a message of love and beauty and acceptance. And I don't know, can you help me with that?
Yes. Let's do this. How many people here are actually on TikTok? Can I see? Okay, so maybe that's like 30%. Mm-hmm. So I think one of the things is to be a part of the conversation, you have to be on these platforms. You don't have to use them every day. You don't have to spend hours. But I think it is so critical as we are navigating this new world for you to be a participant. Because I think there's a lot of misinformation and a lot of misunderstandings around how TikTok or any other social platform or any new technology that comes, how it actually works. So when I was at TikTok, one of the things we did was actually had TikTok creators create videos that asked people to pause and not continue watching on TikTok. So if you're on the app for over 2 hours, a video would come up and say, hey, hi, I'm like your local friendly creator. It's time for you to take a break. Do you want to go outside? And these videos would pop up on a regular timed basis, depending on how long you'd been on the app. And those were incredibly powerful because it was speaking within the voice of TikTok to the TikTok community from the TikTok community. That's one example of the intentionality that I think is critical to have in this day and age when we're thinking about creating and safeguarding positive experiences.
Yeah.
The other thing to what you're saying is, you know, the idea of having a positive, safe environment, and how do you foster that?
Yeah.
The reason I was at TikTok was because that was the mission statement, which was to provide a place of joy and creativity. And that led a lot of decision making. And when we think about the policies that we're implementing, all of that was driven with that mission in mind. And so again, looking at the positives of the platform, you see people on TikTok supporting one another within the community, whether it's their motivation to exercise, their ability to come out. There are so many positive applications and expressions that I think we don't want to discredit here in this conversation. Yeah. There's obviously the flip side of that, and the challenges are how do you not allow open platforms and the conversation to lead to polarization, which I think is really a critical topic that we're not spending enough time on in the US. And again, such a critical topic as we are in an election year. Yeah. And that to me is where it comes back to what are the platform's policies, how do they safeguard the communities, and the actual freedom of expression without going into polarization.
And if I go on and I click on something that says on this conspiracy theory, and the algorithm just feeds me more conspiracy theories because it's like, well, that's what he wants to do. Is that the right approach? Or is there never approach that, yeah, he wants more conspiracy theories, but we're not going to provide that. We're going to reset our algorithm. Yeah.
So again, like that goes back to the beliefs and desires of each platform in terms of what they're going to credit. And I think we've seen a worrying shift with platforms like X, which have slashed their trust and safety teams. Yeah. They've removed policies under this guise of freedom of speech. And it has worrying implications for the reasons that you're saying. There are, at TikTok, a differing set of policies which will discredit those types of conspiracy theories. That misinformation will get taken down. And I think that's where we have to, as informed citizens, apply pressure to platforms around what are the policies, how are they implemented, and get to better standards that respect the types of communities and self-expression that we want to see.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you so much. Really, really appreciate you being here.
Thank you.